We're going to be talking about the Inca work known as the Alto Capu Tunic. But before we do, there are two things I'd like you to think about and then write down real quickly for me, please. The first thing is this. In our society today, what do you think is the raw material that is most highly valued, most highly prized to make desirable objects from? The second question is, if there is a person in our culture that has power and authority and who wants to be perceived and respected as a person with power and authority, then how is that person going to choose to dress? Even better, what might they choose to wear in order to be perceived as a person with power and authority? So now that you've had time to think about those two questions, we're going to see that the theme of precious materials from which luxury items are made, and the second theme of how does a person with power and authority put things on their body, what do they wear to help them communicate power and authority. Both of those themes are going to be attached to this work that we're talking about right here. So the Alto Capu Tunic, we'll look at it in just a minute, but first let's look at a map of the Inca Empire when it was at its peak just before the arrival of the Spaniards. We can see from the map that it stretched north to south some 2,500 miles. Now within that area, we can see that it starts over here at the Pacific coast, which is a long area of very arid climate, desert-like climate, and then it climbs all the way up to really high mountains in the Andes, and then plunges down into the Amazon basin and the rainforest that is found right there. So this really varied climate. Now within all of this territory and these varied climates, what we had were 100 different distinct cultural groups that were under the rule of the Inca, and the population of the Inca Empire with all of those groups was probably somewhere in the range of about 12 million people at its height. What the Inca did when they arrived is they gave precious gifts, valuable gifts to the local rulers. So, for example, we looked at the spondylus shells, those beautiful conch shells that they used as trumpets at Chavin, and so they would give these gifts that were carved with beautiful designs. They might give these as precious gifts. They would also give them gifts that were created from gold that was mined high in the Andes Mountains. But the most precious gift of all that they could give, because this was what was valued more in Inca culture than even objects made of gold, was they gave gifts of precious textiles. Now, isn't that interesting that textiles or cloth, things that were woven, that were made from cloth, that these were considered the most valuable goods that you could give to another person? I just think that's fascinating. So, let's talk for a moment about how did giving those gifts bring about the system that enabled the Inca to have a kind of mutual beneficial arrangement with the people whom they ruled. After giving them these gifts, then what was communicated was that the people who came into the empire therefore owed an obligation back to the Inca, and this obligation was usually in the form of a certain number of hours of labor that their people had to provide, and a certain proportion of whatever their local products were. So what was the traditional way of weaving in this part of the world? We see here in this Diego Rivera painting from the 1930s what is known as a backstrap. You can see it goes around behind the woman, and she can lean forward to loosen the tension, lean back to make it tighter. And so the vertical threads that go from the top down to the bottom that we look at right here, these are known as the warp threads. Now, they're made from a plant fiber, mainly cotton, and so that serves as sort of like the strong skeleton. Those fibers would not be dyed. Plant fibers don't hold dye as effectively as animal fibers, and so animal fiber is then used for what goes across from side to side. This is what would be dyed and would be woven so expertly to create the beautiful patch. when we talk about the kinds of garments that are actually worn by the Inca, the main garment that they wore was a tunic. And you probably know that a tunic is a garment that is worn on the upper part of the body. And basically what it is a long woven rectangular piece of cloth. And traditionally, they try to do it all in one piece without ever making any sort of cutting. Because the idea is that when you start weaving it, then the spirit of the weaving grows as the process continues. And you don't want to damage that by doing any cutting. And so when they are weaving it, they leave this opening right here for the head to come through, and then they fold it over from one end to the other and sew it down the sides, leaving openings right here for the arms to come through. So if you were a peasant, your tunic was probably completely plain, without any dye, without any kind of design at all. But if you were a person of the upper class, if you were a dignitary or a noble of some kind, then you may have been given a piece of a beautiful piece of textile that was created by the group of women in the capital city whose role is to serve the emperor. Now, these chosen women are called the aklakuna, and they were selected when they were like 10 years old. It was a huge honor. The daughters of nobles selected to live their lives in service to the ruler. And so they lived these very cloistered lives. They never married, and they were the ones who were taught how to make this extraordinary textile that is just unsurpassed in world history. Now, the designs that we are looking at right here are ones that would be worn by the nobles. And so each one has a distinctive geometric pattern called a tokapu. And so the tokapu communicate, or a visual way of communicating things about the wearer, what their position is, what their role in society is. And so, for example, these that we see over here, we see 3 different identical ones, because this design, this checkerboard design with the red triangular part at the top, this was the tokapu that was worn by people within the military. But if you were the emperor himself, you were going to be wearing a tunic that had all of the designs of all of the tokapu. So we are looking right here. We're going to talk more about that in a second, but we're looking right here at one of the 2 precious dyes that was reserved for the highest ranking people within Incan culture. And those 2 dyes were blue and red. Now we're looking at the creation of red dye here. The source for the red dye is a little bug that lives on prickly pear cactus. We've got these in my neighborhood. When I go for a walk, I will see prickly pear cactus and these little white spots that look almost sort of like mold. If you get that and you squeeze it, then you get this bright red color on your fingers. And so when that's dyed, it can be ground into what is then turned into really, really beautiful dye that results in the kinds of reds that we see here in our object, in the image set that would have been worn almost certainly by the ruler himself, this called the all-tokapu tunic. So the first thing I want to do is I want to ask you, why would they make the decision to include all of the Incan designs, all of the other tokapu, into one thing worn by the ruler, instead of giving the ruler his own unique geometric design, his own tokapu? Why put all of the tokapu onto his tunic instead of giving him his own design, his own tokapu? Take a minute to think about that and write that down for me, please. All right. What we believe is the reason that that was done was because this, therefore, becomes a visual communication of the fact that in this vast empire with these millions of people from all of these different geographic areas and with all of these diverse needs, the only person who has the ability, who has the authority, who has the skill to be able to rule everyone and take care of everyone's needs is the emperor himself. And so he wears the tokapu, for example. Let's go to this one right here. This one, we saw this a minute ago, is the tokapu worn by whom? That's right. It's worn by people within the military. And so by having this on the ruler's tunic, that's saying that the ruler is the commander-in-chief. Now this one right over here is the tokapu that would be worn by government officials. And so by wearing their tokapu, what that communicates is that the emperor is the chief executive of all of the Inca people. And so the same thing with all of these other tokapu that we are looking at, is that it communicates that the emperor is the one who has the authority over each and every person and each and every role within Incan culture. Wow, that's cool. All right, now, before we move on, I want you to take a minute to sketch this military tokapu and then sketch this even simpler government official tokapu. Then come back to me. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the kind of wool that was used in these highest ranking, most precious garments that were made by the Aklakuna. So first of all, the animal from which the wool came for these most precious pieces of textile, which were called the kompi, Qompi, that's that most precious, most valuable textile created by the Aklakuna. The animal that came from was the alpaca. The alpaca fur is the finest fur, much finer than that is found on llamas, for example. And so that's what was used for high status weaving. However, what we believe is that, or at least some people believe that, for the tunic that was to be worn by the emperor himself, the fur was actually taken not just from any old alpaca, but actually from a baby alpaca, and not just anywhere on a baby alpaca. That the fur that was used for the emperor's tunic, the Altopaku tunic, was the finest fur on the body of the baby alpaca, which was the belly fur of the baby alpaca. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so when we look at this, we are seeing a Spanish-era illustration that shows the emperor wearing the Altopaku tunic with other emblems of his being the ruler. And then over here on the left, we see a Spanish-era illustration of the chosen women, the Aklakuna themselves. Now, before we leave this, the last thing I want to say about this is that we admire the textiles created by the Aklakuna within the Inca Empire, because within the pre-industrial world, the way that we measure the quality of textile is by the number of threads per square inch. The number of threads per square inch that the Aklakuna achieved was about 300 threads per square inch. No other people on the face of the earth ever achieved that thread count per square inch before the Industrial Revolution. It's not until before we get weaving machinery that we're able to get a higher thread count than that. So a beautiful object that was given as diplomatic gifts to ensure that the Inca had the labor and the materials coming in from all of the provinces all over. The second thing would be to clothe those highest ranking people within the governmental structure, and most specifically the emperor himself, to keep him warm and to communicate his power. And then a third purpose for the fine cloth created by the Aklakuna is that it was the most precious gift that was then burned as a sacrifice to the sun god Inti. So please think about and write down your explanation for how the Altopaku tunic successfully fulfills the desires of its patron, the ruler, to communicate his power and his authority over all of his subjects in his realm.